Welcome to my reading of History, Fiction, or Science Chronology number 1 by Anatoly T. Fomenko. As a disclaimer, I would like to say that I neither support nor utterly reject the claims made by Fomenko, Nosovsky, or anyone else involved in the creating and writing of this book. But since I have owned this book for a couple of years and had at first not given it much of a chance because of my different mindset at the time, and because of more recent readings I've done in it, I've found that it has abundant, useful illustrations of the ways that the sciences, and most specifically history and chronology, can and has been warped. And because I can't find anyone else reading this book in English, and also because I don't monetize my channel, so it's less likely that I will be getting any kind of copyright strikes here, because I am not profiting in any way from this, but simply sharing information. I will publish the address on archive.org, where anyone can go and read a digital copy of it, which often is very hard on my eyes. So I have my own copy in front of me. I will be using this digital copy whenever there are photographs or charts that would be good to look at. We will then use this. So I'm going to start by giving you the publisher. The publisher was one of the reasons that I decided to give this book a second chance. It says Delamere Publishing, and if you do a search on Delamere, you will find out that this publisher is Delamere Resources, LLC, Professional Arts Building, Suite 1, 206 11th Avenue, Southeast, Olympia, Washington, 98501. Obviously, they are a very small publisher, it would seem. If you do a search on them as far as businesses and business listings in the state of Washington, it would appear that, there's no longer listings for them as in active listings in some of the business searches that I've done. And whether or not they're out of business, I don't know. But they certainly don't seem to be in the line of something like, let's say, Oxford University Press, which I would be hard-pressed to trust anything by. So I'm going to actually start, and again, I am not going to be following on screen. If you want to read the book at archive.org, feel free. But I will have it at the section where I'm going to be starting, so that if I come across photos that should be shown, I can easily flip to them. I'm going to start with the foreword by Alexander Zinoviev. And for any of my Russian-speaking friends, do try to be patient concerning my pronunciation of Russian names. They are, after all, foreign to me. Furthermore, I have determined to limit commentary during the reading of this. I will try to keep that very low, lest it be something so painfully obvious. I will very much try to put that at the end. So, A Global Falsification of History, forward by Alexander Zinoviev. I familiarized myself with the works of A.T. Fomenko comparatively recently, and they impressed me greatly. What part of them struck me as the most stunning? First and foremost, it was the intellectual capacity observable behind them. The authors reveal a way of cogitating that manages to fuse austere logic with dialectic flexibility. This is truly a rare occurrence in the field of social studies. Reading the Œuvres of A.T. Fomenko and his co-author G.V. Nosovsky, occasionally several times over, was a veritable intellectual delight for yours truly. They flabbergasted me with the sheer disquisitive might as well as the research results which, in my opinion, can by rights be called the greatest discovery in contemporary historical science. What A.T. Fomenko and his colleagues had learnt over the course of their research was the fact that the entire history of humanity up until the 17th century is a forgery of global proportions. Old history, in their terminology, a falsification as deliberate as it is universal. I shall be referring to this falsification as the first one. My sociological research of the Great Evolutionary Breakpoint demonstrated that a new blatant, global, and premeditated falsification was already in full swing. Prior to becoming familiar with the writings of Fomenko, I had already known that the falsification of the past was a rather common phenomenon inherent in human existence. However, I was neither aware of the scale of this fraud, as described by Fomenko and his fellow scholars, nor of its social type. My assumption had been that the blatant falsification of history on a planetary scale that I discovered was the first one in what concerned the proportions and the ulterior motivation, as well as its historical role. Let us call it the second falsification of the same variety. It differs from the first in terms of pertaining to a different epoch. Its main subject is modern history, and whatever historical period can be claimed as relevant to and seen as fitting for the purposes of this falsification. The second falsification also differs from the first one in its primary means and methods, which shall be described below. One has to differentiate between the two kinds of falsification, the first one being the involuntary routine falsification of minor details that results from the mechanisms of gnosis and those of the actual description of historical events, or the entropy inherent in the framework of humanity's historical memory. The second is the extraordinary, premeditated, and complex falsification that has distinct social causes. Let us consider the former kind first. We shall disregard the period preceding the epoch of literacy and symbolic systems. The mnemonic means available back then were less than meager, which automatically diminished the arsenal of the hypothetical falsifiers. We should turn to the era of literacy instead. It is common knowledge that historical events became immanentized in human language, and a statement uttered is a lie, as the old saying goes. We cannot fathom the unfathomable. What we end up doing is raking the vastness of history for tiny morsels of information and adding some of our own narrative in order to produce wholesome and coherent textual material. The modern information technology does not affect the principles that the status quo relies upon. Let us introduce the concept of historical atoms, or particles that aren't subject to further division. One may well calculate that the verbal description of a single year of real history, the way it really happened, including all manner of events, no matter how minute, would require the processing power of all the computers on the planet, with all people made computer operators. De facto, this terminology serves as a powerful instrument of historical falsification. It allows for the possibility of drowning a scientific approach to historical events in an ocean of meaningless facts. Furthermore, the description of actual historical events is done by humans and not perfect divine entities. People are brought up and educated in a certain way and have a certain social standing, as well as egotistical goals and aims of their very own. All of this affects the way the information is processed. Over the course of time, the overwhelming majority of events are wiped away into oblivion without leaving the merest trace. They are frequently not even realized as events. The people's attitude to the past begins to alter as past events gradually drift in an altogether different observational and interpretational context. Evolutionary process discerns between two kinds of events, preliminal and superliminal. The former kind does not affect the general character of evolution. The latter one does. However, humans, including specialists, fail to recognize the difference between the two. Everyone who knows perfectly well how much attention is poured over rather insignificant individuals such as kings and presidents, whereas the really important events often don't even get so much as a passing reference. This affects the relations between historical events in so much that all sense of measure is often lost. Even if we are to suppose that all those who partake in the creation of historical records see veracity as their mission, the result of their collective efforts is often the rendition of their own subjective views on history as opposed to what happened in reality. As centuries pass by, the stream of disinformation is fed by various sources and tributaries which, in their multitude, produce the effect of impartial falsification of historical events. This stream also feeds on murky rivulets of countless liars and swindlers. The false model of history serves its functions for a certain while. However, humanity eventually enters a period when the distorted representation loses efficiency and stops serving its ends. This is where people are supposed to start searching for explanations and set out on their quest for a truth. However, there is the abstract scientific kind of truth and the actual historical variety. That is to say, something that people regard or will at some point start regarding as truth. The very word truth is confusing here. We shall be on safer ground if we are to consider the adequacy of having certain concepts of the past for the new needs that have manifested as a result of the historical process. These concepts stop being valid for satisfying these needs. One becomes aware of the necessity to update our view of the past in accordance with whatever the present stipulates. This awareness is the kind of craving that can only be satisfied by a bona fide rectification of history, which has to occur as a grandiose paradigm shift. Moreover, It has to be a large-scale organized operation, one that shall result in an epochal falsification of the entire history of humankind. The issue at hand is by no means the falsification of individual observations of historical events, but rather the revision of the entirety of historical records describing the events which cannot be observed as a principle since they belong to the past. What we are talking about is not a mere change in the perception and interpretation of the same old existential phenomena. It is the adaptation of the charactery which naturally used to refer to certain commonplace realities at some point, to the exigencies of people who have to live in an altogether different environment. Trained specialists are a sine qua non for this, people whose activities shall have to be organized in such a manner that their collective output will result in the creation of a coordinated historical gestalt. When they really have to do is create exactly the kind of past that is needed for the present, making use of whatever available material presents itself. The first global falsification of history, as discovered and brilliantly related by Fomenko, was based on an erroneous temporal and spatial coordinate system of chronological events, the chronological system and the localization of events wedded thereto. The more recent and ongoing second global falsification of history is based on a system of erroneous pseudo-scientific sociological concepts based upon ideology and aided greatly by the modern information manipulation technology. This is why I call the second falsification conceptual and informational, or merely conceptual for brevity's sake. Fomenko's works describe the technology of building a false model of human history which uses the art of manipulating the temporal and spatial coordinates of events. Many thousands of specialists in false historical models are already working on this second falsification. Their forte is the ability to misrepresent historical events while giving correct temporal and spatial coordinates and representing individual facts veraciously in full detail. The actual falsification is achieved via the selection of facts, their combination and interpretation, as well as the context of ideological conceptions, propagandist texts that they are immersed into, etc. In order to describe the technology behind the second falsification with any degree of clarity at all, exhaustively and convincingly, one needs a well-developed scientific system of logistics and methodology, as well as a sociological theory. I call such a system logical sociology. However, it is a thing of the future, which means that the second falsification of history shall continue in its present manner with as much ease and impunity as the first. Tens and hundreds of years hence, a number of solitary researchers shall excavate the so-called modern history in very much the same manner as Fomenko and his predecessors, including N.A. Morozov, have treated old history. I would like to conclude with an observation concerning the exceptional scientific scrupulousness of the works of A. Fomenko and G. Nosovsky. I have examined them from exactly this position many a time, and I have neither found a single ipse dixit statement nor any categorical pontificating of any kind. The general narrative scheme they employ is as follows. The authors relate the consensual textbook historical concepts and then cite historical facts which either fail to concur to said concepts or contradict them explicitly. Other authors who have noticed these inconsistencies are quoted. Then Fomenko and Nosovsky put forth hypotheses which allow to find logically correct solutions for the problems under study. They keep on emphasizing and reiterating that the issue at hand is all about hypotheses and not categorical statements presented as the truth absolute. The readers are invited to take part in the solution of problems that arise as a consequence of the consensual chronological concept of history. I am amazed by the horrendous injustice of the numerous critics of Fomenko and Nosovsky, who obviously distort their ideas, either failing to understand them completely or being altogether unfamiliar with their content. It is also quite astounding that whenever a publication occurs that voices ideas that bear semblance to those of Fomenko and Nosovsky, but are a lot more tame and local, providing a lot less factual information, this publication is usually accepted with a great deal more benevolence. I understand the psychological groundwork beneath this. Fomenko and Nosovsky have performed a great scientific feat of epochal significance, one that affects the sentiments and interests of too many people. Acknowledging this feat as such, or at the very least the mere fact of its creative relevance, obligates one to actions that are apparently beyond these people due to their incapacity and immaturity. The trouble with Fomenko and Nosovsky is that they have reached out too far and dealt the dominating historical discourse too heavy a blow. Alexander Zinoviev, 10th of October, 1999. 19 April 2001. As a footnote at the end, Alexander Zinoviev, professor of the Moscow State University, logician, sociologist, writer, member of the Finnish, Bavarian, and Italian Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Polite Letters, and several others. Laureate of the 1982 Alexis Tocqueville Prize for Sociology and the Best Sociology Essay of 1979 prize, as well as a large number of European and international prizes for literature. Honorary citizen of several French and Italian towns and cities. The works of A.A. Zinoviev are published in more than 20 languages and considered international bestsellers. He reads lectures on sociology in many European and American universities. Next, the foreword by A. Shiriev, 1990. To the first edition of A.T. Fomenko's Methods of Statistical Analysis of Narrative Texts and Their Applications to Chronology, 1990, based on research materials of 1973 through 1988. The methods of applied statistics affect a wide range of scientific paradigms today, including the research of a great variety of texts. We use the word text to refer to sequences of diverse signals here, such as the lengthy codes one finds in genetics, graphical representations of this kind, or the other that can be encoded and represented in a textual form and actual narrative texts, such as the historical chronicles, original sources, documents, etc. One of the key objectives we have here is learning to identify dependent texts, by which we mean texts possessing some degree of affinity between them, similarities in their nature or history. For instance, we may regard the recognition problem as an example where one is confronted with the task of finding the visual representation that bears the greatest resemblance to the given prototype. The subject of long signal sequence research emphasizes the ability to find uniform subsequences and their joining points. All of the above bears equal relevance to solving the classical change point problem, for instance, which is of vital importance to mathematical statistics and the statistics of stochastic processes. In application to narrative text studies and their needs, the problem of differentiating between dependent and independent texts, such as chronicles, can be formulated as that of tracing out the texts that hail back to a common original source, the ones that can logically be referred to as dependent, or those of non-correlating origins, the ones we can logically refer to as independent. It is well understood that problems of this kind are exceptionally complex, and thus new empirico-statistical identification methods deserve full recognition for their ability to complement classical approaches to actual research in source studies, for instance. The present book by A.T. Fomenko, professor of pure mathematics, is primarily oriented at the development of said methods as applied to identifying and dating dependent and independent texts in relation to the texts that possess veritable datings a priori. The author of the book suggests a new approach to the recognition of dependent and independent narrative historical texts based on a number of models he had constructed and trends discovered with the aid of empirico-statistical methods, and as a result of extensive statistical experimentation with varying quantitative characteristics of actual texts such as chronicles, original sources, etc. The verification of these models, statistical hypotheses, by subsistent chronicle material confirmed their efficacy and allowed us to suggest new methods of dating texts, or rather, the events they describe. The approach suggested by A.T. Fomenko is rather unorthodox and requires the reader to possess a certain degree of attentiveness and diligence in order to become accustomed with his innovative logical constructions, which may be perceived as uncanny. However, one has to note that the author's principal ideas are perfectly rational from the point of view of contemporary mathematical statistics and fit into the cognitive paradigm of experts in applied statistics with the utmost ease. The scientific results obtained by the author are most remarkable indeed, and what we witness today can already be referred to as the rather sudden evolvement of a whole new scientific division in applied statistics that is definitely of interest to us. All of the results in question were educed from a tremendous body of work performed by the author with the assistance of his fellow academicians, most of them specializing in mathematical statistics and its applications. Seeing as how the book relates to problems that concern several scientific disciplines, one is confronted with the necessity of finding points of contact between experts working in different areas. A wide number of terms and definitions common for scholars of one discipline may need to be explicitly translated for scientists of a different specialization and orientation. This is to be borne in mind by the representatives of both natural sciences and humanities among the readers of this book. However, said miscommunications are common and are easily overcome by any mixed collective of scientists collaborating on the solution of a particular problem. One may hope that the potential readers may prove this very collective that will carry on with the research commenced by an eminent professional mathematician. In addition to the development of new empirico-statistical methods as applied to the dating of events, the present book contains a number of applications to the problem of validating the chronology of historical events. One has to differ clearly here between the primary statistical result achieved by the book, namely defining the layer structural of the global chronological map and its representation as a sum of 4 layers, and the plethora of available interpretations. Interpreting the results and building hypotheses is well beyond the scope of precise mathematical knowledge, so the author urges us to be extremely careful with the conclusions relating to a potential revision of the static chronology of ancient history. The author repeatedly insists on the necessity of critical analysis and separating verified facts from their interpretations and various hypotheses. The concept offered by A.T. Fomenko is novel and somewhat startling, and by all means deserves a meticulous study. The book is written in conformance to the most demanding scientific standards and is an unprecedented phenomenon in the area of international scientific literature on applied mathematical statistics, so no reader shall be left indifferent. It also offers us a glimpse of the rather charming personality of its author, a mathematician and a history scholar. One hopes that the reader studies the book in its entirety with undiminished attention after the perusal of the first couple of pages, and, at the very least, becomes familiar with a fascinating scientific problem, or maybe even joins the research in this new and promising field of science. A.N. Shiryaev, president of the International Bernoulli Society for Mathematical Statistics and Probability Theory in 1989 through 1991. A.N. Shiryaev, corresponding member of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Doctor of Physics and Mathematics, head of the Probability Theory Studies Department of the Moscow State University Department of Mathematics and Mechanics, head of the Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics Department of the V.A. Steklov Mathematics Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Now, there is a page with the publisher's note, and in my opinion, it is mostly an advertising or marketing blurb, but nevertheless, I will read it. Publisher's note. History, Fiction, or Science is the most explosive tractate on history ever written. However, every theory it contains, no matter how unorthodox, is backed by solid scientific data. The book contains 446 graphs and illustrations, copies of ancient manuscripts, and countless facts attesting to the falsity of the chronology used nowadays, which never cease to amaze the reader. Eminent mathematician proves that Jesus Christ was born in 1152 A.D. and crucified in 1185 A.D. The Old Testament refers to medieval events. Apocalypse was written after 1486. Does this sound uncanny? This version of events is substantiated by hard facts and logic, validated by new astronomical research and statistical analysis of the ancient sources to a greater extent than everything you may have read and heard about history before. The dominating historical discourse in its current state was essentially crafted in the 16th century from a rather contradictory jumble of sources such as innumerable copies of ancient Latin and Greek manuscripts whose originals had vanished in the Dark Ages, and the allegedly irrefutable proof offered by late medieval astronomers, resting upon the power of ecclesial authorities. Nearly all of its components are blatantly untrue. For some of us, it shall possibly be quite disturbing to see the magnificent edifice of classical history turn into an ominous simulacrum brooding over the snake pit of medieval politics. Twice so, in fact, the first time the legendary millenarian dust on the ancient marble turn into a mere layer of dirt, one that meticulous, unprejudiced research can eventually remove. The second, the greater attack of unease, comes with the awareness of just how many areas of human knowledge still trust the three elephants of the consensual chronology to support them. Nothing can remedy that except for an individual chronological revolution happening in the minds of a large enough number of people. Now, the preface by Anatoly T. Fomenko. The materials contained in this book correspond to the research that was started in 1973. One might wonder why we should want to revise the chronology of ancient history today and base our revision on new empirico-statistical methods. It would be worthwhile to remind the reader that in the 16th through 17th century, chronology was considered to be a subdivision of mathematics, prior to having gradually transformed into a field of historical studies considered complete in general and only requiring minor eventual clarifications, leaving the actual edifice of chronology intact. And yet we discover that the contemporary official version of the chronology of ancient history is full of prodigious contradictions and inconsistencies that deserve an attempt of partial clarification and rectification based on the methods of modern statistics at the very least. One often hears the question about what could possibly motivate a mathematician into wanting to study a seemingly historical problem. The answer is as follows. My primary interests are those of a professional mathematician. They are thus rather distant from historical and chronological issues. However, in the early 70s, namely in 1972 through 1973, I had to deal with the dates of ancient eclipses during my studies of one of the key problems in celestial mechanics. See Chronology 1, Chapter 2 for more details. It had to do with computing the so-called coefficient d in the theory of lunar motion. The parameter characterizes acceleration and is computed as a time function on a large historical interval. The computations were performed by Robert Newton, a contemporary American astronomer and astrophysicist. Upon their completion, he had made the unexpected discovery of parameter d behaving in the most peculiar manner, namely, performing an inexplicable leap on the interval of 8th through 10th century A.D. This leap cannot be explained by conventional gravitational theory and is improbable to the extent of making Robert Newton invent mysterious extra-gravitational forces in the Earth-Moon system that suspiciously refuse to manifest in any other way. This inexplicable effect attracted the professional interest of the mathematician in me. The verification of R. Newton's work showed that his computations conformed to the highest scientific standards and contained no errors. This made the gap in the diagram even more enigmatic. A prolonged pondering of this topic led me to the idea of checking the exactitude of datings of the ancient eclipses that the d-parameter computations were based upon, since they implicitly affected the result. This idea turned out to have been unprecedented for the scientists that had dealt with the problem previously. Robert Newton himself, an eminent expert in the field of astronavigation and the oretical dynamics of natural and artificial celestial bodies, trusted the ancient historical dates completely and attempted to explain the leap in the behavior of parameter d from within his professional paradigm, that is to say, without the merest hint of the very idea of questioning ancient chronology. I was more fortunate in the respect I found out that N.A. Morozov, a renowned Russian scientist and encyclopedist, had analyzed the datings of ancient eclipses and claimed most of them to be in need of revision. This happened as early as the beginning of the 20th century. He offered new datings for a large number of eclipses that were considered more recent. Having obtained his tables, I repeated Newton's calculations using Morozov's dates in lieu of the consensual ones as input data. I was amazed to discover that the D graph altered instantly and drastically, transforming into a rather even horizontal line that had concurred with the conventional gravitational theory perfectly. The enigmatic leap disappeared along with the necessity to invent fictitious extra-gravitational forces. The satisfaction from having finished a body of scientific work successfully was accompanied by a sudden awareness of a very knotty point arising in the respect, one of the great peculiarity and paramount importance, namely, that of whether the consensual chronology of ancient history was to be trusted at all. It was true that the new datings of many ancient eclipses offered by N.A. Morozov led to the equalization of the D-function diagram, the elimination of a strange contradiction from celestial mechanics, and to the discovery of the conformance of an important parameter in the theory of lunar motion to perfectly normal patterns of behavior. It was equally true, however, that fitting something like the idea that the three ancient eclipses described in the history of the prominent ancient author Thucydides took place in the 11th or even the 12th century A.D., and not in the 5th B.C., as it is believed today, into one's perception proved quite impossible. The issue here is that the dating of the triad of Thucydides can only correspond to these two astronomically precise solutions. See Chronology 1, Chapter 2. The inevitable question that arose in this respect was that of which discipline had been correct in this case, astronomy or contemporary chronology. I had to address several distinguished historians with this issue, including the ones from our very own Moscow State University. Their initial reaction was that of polite restraint. According to them, there was no point whatsoever in questioning the consensual chronology of ancient history, since all the dates in question can easily be verified by any textbook on the subject and were proved veracious a long time ago. The fact that the diagram of some parameter d started to look natural after revised calculations based on some flimsy new chronology was hardly of any relevance. Moreover, it would perhaps be better for the mathematicians to occupy themselves with mathematics and leave the history to historians. The same sentiment was expressed to me by L. N. Gumilyov. I refrained from arguing with him. The reply offered by the historians failed to satisfy me. Firstly, due to the fact that chronology, being a problem of calculating dates, bears immediate relevance to applied mathematics. This includes astronomical calculations, the verification of their precision, calendar problems, the interpretation of old writings based on their frequency, characteristics, etc., and may present an extensive number of complex issues. Secondly, becoming familiar with the contemporary chronological tables soon proved that the ancient dates were quoted rather arbitrarily, with hardly any references at all given anywhere. At best, the first chronological tables get a quote. However, those were compiled relatively recently, in the 16th through 17th century. Delving deeper into the problem revealed that the version of chronology that we agree upon today wasn't the only one available historically. I found out that eminent scientists from various countries expressed the idea that ancient datings required a radical revision. I realized that the answer was the furthest thing from simple, and that shedding some light on the issue would require plenty of time and effort. This is how 1973 saw me commencing work in this direction, aided by colleagues, most of them professional mathematicians and physicists. The research progressed rapidly. Over the years that passed since 1973, many points have been clarified and a great volume of interesting information obtained. A lot of it was published by myself and my colleagues in a number of books and scientific articles quoted in the bibliography. The first related publication saw light in 1980. It has to be noted that over the course of time, our opinions on certain chronological problems have changed. Said alterations never concerned the general picture, but occasionally led to significant shifts in our perceptions of details. Today we feel that the empirico-statistical methods that our chronological research was based upon need to be formulated and coordinated again. This is how the books Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 came into existence. Chronology 1 is based on the first book I wrote on the subject, Methods of Statistical Analysis of Narrative Texts and Their Application to Chronology, Identifying and Dating Dependent Texts, the Statistical Chronology of Ancient History, the Statistics of Ancient Reports of Astronomical Events. It was published by the Moscow State University in 1990. A further revised and extended edition appeared in 1996 under the title Methods of Mathematical Analysis of Historical Texts and Their Applications to Chronology, Moscow Nauka Publishing, 1996. The present book contains the entire material in a revised, extended, and coordinated form. Chronology 2 contains an extended version of the two of my books, Global Chronology, Moscow MSU 1993, and The New Chronology of Greece, the Medieval Age of Classics, Moscow MSU 1996. Certain important results that get briefly mentioned in Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 were achieved with the aid of outstanding scientists. Professor V. V. Kalashnikov, Doctor of Physical and Mathematical Science, Moscow State University, and the National Research Institute for System Studies, Moscow, Russia, and the Senior Scientific Associate G. V. Nosovsky, candidate of Physical and Mathematical Sciences, the Department of Mathematics and Mechanics, Moscow State University. Experts in fields of probability theory studies and mathematical statistics. The formation of the author's concept of chronology is largely a result of his having collaborated with V.V. Kalashnikov and G.V. Nosovsky for many years, and I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to both of them. I would like to state explicitly that over the period of time from 1981 and until presently, our collaboration with G.V. Nosovsky has been constant and very fruitful, as the two of us have published a number of what we consider to be milestones of the new chronology. The formulation of the main principles of reconstructing modern chronology and medieval history is a direct result of the work we have done together over these years, which adds particular importance to this period. Let us briefly describe the structure of Chronology 1 and Chronology 2. The consensual versions of chronology, as well as those of ancient and medieval history, have evolved completely by the 17th century AD and appear to contain major flaws. Many prominent scientists are aware of this and have discussed it for quite a while. See Chronology 1, Chapter 1. However, the creation of a new concept of history that would be free from inconsistencies proved a truly formidable task. A group of mathematicians, most of them from Moscow State University, commenced their research of the problem in 1974. The results were most captivating and got covered in a number of monographs, see the bibliography, and several dozens of publications in scientific periodicals. Let us emphasize that the new concept of chronology is based primarily on applying methods of modern statistics to the analysis of historical sources and extensive cybernetic computations. The main subject of the books Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 is the research of the new empirico-statistical methods of finding dependencies in historical texts and derived procedures of dating historical events. The task of recognizing the difference between dependent and independent texts is really one of identifying images. One encounters it in various scientific paradigms, including applied statistics, linguistics, physics, genetics, historical source studies, etc. Finding dependent texts is of great utility and applied to studying historical sources where they may be traced to a common original that had been lost before our time. It is also very useful to be able to tell which texts are independent or derived from non-correlating sources. The very concept of text can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. Any sequence of symbols, signals, and codes can be referred to as text. The sequences of genetic code in DNA chains, for instance, the common problem of finding dependent texts is formulated as follows. One has to find similar fragments in long signal sequences, that is, fragments of text that duplicate one another. There is a multitude of methods used for the recognition of dependencies and the identification of similar images available today. We offer several new empirico-statistical methods. They might be of use in analyzing historical chronicles, manuscripts, and archive materials, as well as in finding the so-called homologous fragments in texts and of a significantly different, more general nature. This book is divided into several parts or topics for the reader's convenience. This should help us to securely differentiate between proven statistical facts and hypotheses. At the same time, one has to state that such topical division is rather artificial, since the topics really have lots and lots of points in common. The first topic, solving the problem of statistical recognition of dependent and independent historical texts, formulating new statistical models and hypotheses, as well as verifying them with extensive experimental material of actual historical chronicles. It turns out we're able to acquire general verifications of the models offered. In other words, we have managed to discover interesting statistical tendencies that define the evolution of textual information over a period of time, such as what really happens to the data contained in the manuscripts during their duplication, etc. The discovery of these tendencies is our first result. The discovered trends are used as basis for the formulation of new methods of dating the events described in the chronicles. This is achieved by statistical comparison of the chronicles and documents pertinent to the research with the ones possessing confirmed datings. The methods are verified by a large body of correctly dated materials. Their application to the chronicles and documents describing the events of the 17th through 20th century appears to confirm the efficacy of these methods. Namely, the statistical datings that we got as a result of our research concur with the ones confirmed by traditional methods. The a priori dependent chronicle pairs turn out to be dependent statistically with the use of our methods. The ones that are independent a priori turn out to be independent statistically as well. Experimental examination of veraciously dated chronicles describes the events of 17th through 20th century AD, led to the discovery of natural, numerical coefficients that allow us to differentiate between a priori dependent chronicles and a priori independent ones in 1974 through 1979. Basically, these numbers are rather small for a priori dependent pairs and rather large for a priori independent ones. This means that nowadays we can compare arbitrary chronicles X and Y and find out whether their proximity coefficients are within the zone that refers to dependent chronicles or the one that refers to independent ones. It is needless to say that the boundaries of these zones were found experimentally. The discovery of the hidden dependencies that define the evolution of information in rather large historical chronicles, as well as the development and experimental verification of the new dating methods, currently comprising a total of 8, is the second principal result of our work. The datings achieved by our methods cannot be regarded as finite, so we shall refer to them as statistical datings, and nothing more. We shall occasionally drop the word statistical for the sake of brevity. The above is to say that we regard the empirico-statistical dates that we computed to be a result of applying statistical methods to historical materials. Nevertheless, the concurrence of these statistical datings with the ones verified a priori that we have discovered in the interval of the 17th through 20th century AD implies that our results are of an objective nature. The second topic. It can also be referred to as critical. We analyze the traditional datings of events that occurred in ancient and medieval Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean countries, Egypt, and America. Bearing the reader's convenience in mind, we have collected various materials here that can be found scattered across all kinds of scientific literature and are known to specialists of various profiles, but often remain beyond the awareness of the general public. These materials illustrate serious difficulties that are presently inherent in the problem of scientific dating of historical events preceding the 14th century AD. We shall inform the reader of the fundamental research conducted by the prominent Russian scientist and encyclopedist Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov, 1854 through 1946. honorary member of the USSR Academy of Sciences, who was the first to have formulated the problem of confirming the ancient and medieval chronology with the means offered by natural sciences in its entirety, in addition to having collected a great volume of critical materials and suggested a number of innovative hypotheses. We shall also report the chronological research conducted by Sir Isaac Newton, who questioned many datings of historical events and several other representatives of the critical current in history and chronology. We quote from eminent authorities in the fields of archaeology, source studies, and numismatics, and a variety of other well-known scientists, and extensively compared different points of view so that the reader could develop their own opinions of the problems in question. The primary application of novel empirico-statistical methods is the analysis of dates of historical occurrences. This is why we were forced to analyze as many dating versions of events and questions as we could find in this day and age. The issue here is that various ancient and medieval chronicles frequently demonstrate significant discrepancies in their datings of certain important events. Attempting to navigate in this chaos of medieval versions, we devote special attention to those reflected in the chronicles of the 15th through 16th century AD, due to the fact that the chronologists of that epoch were closer in time to the events described than we are. Subsequent chronological versions of 17th through 20th century are often revisions of derivative material, obscuring and heavily distorting the original medieval meaning. Starting with 16th through 17th century AD, the version of the chronology of ancient history that was created in the works of prominent medieval chronologists J. Scaliger and D. Petavius, and in Eros rigidifies. The main points of the official version of contemporary chronology coincide with those of Scaliger and Petavius. Hence, we are to use the term Scaligerian chronology and refer to the consensual datings of ancient events as to Scaligerian datings. We presume the reader to be more or less familiar with the traditional Scaligerian de facto chronology concepts familiar from school and university. We shall thus refrain from quoting the Scaligerian concept in detail, considering this knowledge to be in public domain. On the contrary, we shall be making a special emphasis on its inconsistencies. Further on, we shall give a brief analysis of traditional dating methods, datings based on historical sources, archaeological datings, radiocarbon datings, dendrochronology, etc. It is expedient to allow the reader the evaluation of the veracity and the precision of these methods as well as their application areas. The third topic. In 1975 through 1979, the author compiled a table entitled Global Chronological Map, which may be referred to as GCM for the sake of brevity. It may be regarded as a rather complete Scaligerian textbook of ancient and medieval history. All the principal events of ancient history, with their dates according to Scaliger, the ones used today. Lists of main historical characters, etc., were placed along the horizontal axis of time. All the key original sources that have survived with descriptions of contemporary life were quoted for each epoch. The resulting chronological map contains tens of thousands of names and dates. The physical space it covers amounts to several dozen square meters. This map provided itself a priceless encyclopedia and a great guide for the edifice of contemporary Scaligerian, de facto ancient and medieval chronology. Due to the large volume of the material, it made its way into Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 with many expurgations as small tables and diagrams. The fourth topic. In 1974 through 1979, the entire arsenal of the new empirico-statistical dating methods was applied to the factual material collected on the map of the Scaligerian chronology. This was done by inspecting all manner of pairs of historical epochs and the key original sources pertinent to them. These chronicles were processed statistically and then compared in pairs, and eventually the dependence coefficients of compared historical texts were computed. If such coefficients for the two compared chronicles, X and Y, proved to belong to the same numeric order as those of the a priori dependent chronicles from the certainty interval of the 17th through 20th century AD, we called them statistically dependent. In this case, both correlating epochs, temporal periods, were marked on the map with the same arbitrary chosen symbol, such as the letter R. If the proximity coefficient, or measure of the two compared chronicles, X and Y, proved to belong to the same numeric order as those of the a priori independent chronicles from the certainty interval of the 17th through 20th century AD, we called them statistically independent. In this case, both correlating epochs, or temporal periods, were marked on the map with different arbitrary chosen symbols, such as the letters N and S. As a result of statistical research, pairs of statistically dependent chronicles and epochs pertinent to them were found and exposed in the Scaligerian history textbook. We called such chronicles and the sequences of events they described statistical duplicates. We discovered that the results of using different empirical statistical methods correlate very well. Namely, the chronicle pairs, statistically similar according to one method, turned out to be statistically similar according to all others, if such methods were at all applicable to the chronicles in question. This result correlation is perceived as important. It is vital that our empirico-statistical methods have found no unforeseen duplicates or chronicles whose dependent nature we weren't aware of a priori on the interval of the 17th through 20th century AD. At the same time, the same methods found a large number of new statistically similar chronicles, duplicates, that were previously considered underived, independent in every sense of the word, and ascribed to various epochs before the 17th century AD, preceding the 11th century in particular. The compilation of the Scaligerian chronological map and the discovery of statistical duplicates therein amount to the third principal result of this book. The fourth principal result is the division of the Scaligerian chronological map into a sum of the 4 chronicle layers discovered by the author. These chronicle layers are nearly identical, but they are shifted in time in relation to each other. These shifts amount to significant amounts of time, and their correspondent chronicle layers may be regarded as short chronicles of sorts. A very rough description of the contemporary Scaligerrian textbook of ancient and medieval history would be calling it a sum or a collage of 4 copies of the same short chronicle, statistically speaking. A criticism of the Scaligerrian chronology and the description of the 4 statistical results mentioned above comprise the main part of the present book. Its other parts are of a hypothetical and interpretational nature. They aid the formulation of a possible answer to the naturally occurring question about the meaning of all the discovered empirico-statistical facts and what the history was really like. The 5th topic. This topic can be called interpretational. This is where we offer the hypotheses that may explain the trends we have discovered and the reasons why the Scaligerrian textbook of history might contain duplicates. Neither this material nor the truncated history textbook that we offer are to be considered finite in any way. They may only be regarded as offering a possible version that requires a great body of work to be conducted by experts of various profiles and maybe even special research facilities. The author's position on a significant number of points raised in Chronology 1 and Chronology 2 has formed as a result of interaction, collective research, and extensive discussions with specialists from a wide variety of fields, most notably the field of mathematics and fellow mathematicians. Specifically, the new statistical models and the results we have achieved have all been presented and discussed over the span of the past 20-plus years. The 4th and 5th International Probability Theory and Mathematical Statistics Conferences in Vilnius, Lithuania, 1981 and 1985. The First International Bernoulli Society for Mathematics, Statistics, and Probability Theory Congress in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, 1986, the Multidimensional Statistical Analysis and Probabilistic Modeling of Real-Time Processes seminar by Professor S.A. Avizian, and the Central Institute of Economics and Mathematics of the USSR Academy of Sciences. Several national seminars on stochastic model continuity and stability by Professor V. M. Zolotaryov, the V.A. Steklov Mathematics Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Professor V.V. Kalashnikov, the National Research Institute for System Studies. And at this point, I'm going to chop some of this up for the sake of my readers. Now, I fully understand Fomenko's reason for providing notation of those that influenced the work that he did scientifically, and giving thanks because after this long list of various academic societies, there is an even far, far longer list of thanks that he gives to a number of different academics and scientists in various fields. And as important as it is, especially if this being a work with the weight that it seems to have, I understand this all going into Fomenko's introduction. However, I'm going to be skipping through it, and will probably only be reading for the sake of the listener. Probably the last couple of paragraphs. After most of the thanks, he provides a re-emphasized thanks to the man who wrote the very first introduction that I read, A. Zinoviev. And then the last few paragraphs of Fomenko's introduction reads, "The present publication of the 7 volumes of chronology only became feasible due to the creation of a special project for the translation of publication of our works on chronology by Yuri Filipov. One has to emphasize that the translation of such a great bulk of complex scientific material is a most grandiose endeavor per se. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to Y.N. Filipov for the gigantic amount of labor invested, and also to the translators and editors for their hard and highly professional work. The book is dedicated to the memory of Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov, brilliant scientist, encyclopedist, and author of the most profound oeuvres on chemistry, physics, mathematics, astronomy, and history. He was the first to have fully formulated the problem of finding scientific bases for ancient and medieval chronology using natural sciences and obtaining fundamental results in this direction. The author would like to express the wish for this 7-volume edition to provide an impetus for the development of new empirical statistical methods of studying historical texts, so that the problems of ancient chronology can be solved in their entirety. A. T. Fomenko, March 2002. And now, a hopefully brief commentary. I'd like to re-emphasize the fact that I am reading this book because, for one thing, I, like many others, am so busy, so frequently on the move, that such important works that more and more people are becoming conscious of, like the work of analyzing the chronology that we have been given, de facto chronology we have been given by the likes of Scaliger, need to be definitely checked for veracity, which seems to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do today. For those who are more interested in understanding more about Scaliger, I would recommend the series that was done with Jacob Duellman on the Gnostic Media podcast. Although I, of course, don't agree with all the points of view of Jan Irvin or the Gnostic Media broadcast, either way, you're going to be able to get a large amount of just plain information that you can take in and digest and do what you like with. That's the same thing with the book, and why I'm reading the book. For all of those who either don't have enough time currently to read, but whose thoughts are so often occupied with this problem of history and geography and modern philosophy and beliefs that have been programmed into us that are not consistent with any small amount of objective truth that we've been able to either observe or experience. This is a fantastically important subject. Now, some time ago, maybe at least well over a year now ago, about a year and a half ago. Since I found nobody on social media taking the topic of phantom time seriously, I did a reading of Emmett Scott's book, A Guide to the Phantom Dark Age. Emmett Scott is, at least at the time of writing that book, part of a group that are definitely more historians than anything else, and they don't tend to question Scaligean chronology except in the realm of 300 years of time, from about 611 or 620 to about 911 or 920. Most specifically, men such as Heribert Illig, who very much popularized this at about the same time that Fomenko was working on his work in the subject. Illig, believing that the inserted years were from actually 620 to 911. Imagine that number. And at the time, I did this reading with prolific commentary all through it, and I know it is a put-off for a number of listeners. So that is why I'm going to restrict it. I am not going to be inserting all of my own personal beliefs, which, for anyone who's listened to my channel for any length of time, know that those beliefs change based on factual information received. This is why I'm doing this, and I have to say I do appreciate that every person, including Fomenko, who has written a preface to this book so far, has emphasized the fact that they require the reader to participate in the conclusions reached, which is exactly what you and I can do with this. So I will pick up again, starting in the in the section History of the New Chronology. Until then, God bless.